Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PSF 401, Political Behavior. This week we are looking at unconventional political participation. Unconventional political participation are politically oriented activities outside of political institutions. Voting, donating, volunteering, these are all operating within the bounds of the democratic institutions. Something like a protest, on the other hand, doesn't have a real direct connection to institutions and therefore to institutional change. When we are looking at protests, the purpose of a protest, and indeed many forms of unconventional political participation, are to demand change. And therefore, the connection between these forms of political participation, protest again as an example, fundamentally is to influence public opinion. Short of changing the government outright, protests are instead intended to highlight specific issues that have been underserved by the current political orientation. Now, in order to discuss this in some detail, we need to discuss how we actually conceptualize politics. Politics itself is best understood as what we call an iterative reciprocal game. This is a game that doesn't occur just in a single shot. Instead, there are many iterations of this game, many elections within this context. Think about a game of Risk as an example. If you are only playing a game of Risk with you and your friends one time, you may not hold back. You may betray alliances. Perhaps you may even cheat if the benefits to winning this game of Risk were sufficient. But instead, suppose that you were going to play 10 games of Risk in a row. You would not be incentivized to be a, shall we say, disreputable ally in that first or second game. Instead, your reputation, your behaviors in that first game, in that second game, are considered by all participants in all subsequent games. Politics, in this context, is not a game with an end, and therefore, when we consider politics in this way, both sides of politics, or all sides of politics, need to accept losing with some degree of grace. Each round of this game, each election, incurs the winning side having some gains and the losing side having some losses. The losing side is incentivized to accept those short-term losses in exchange for future gains. Moreover, they will accept those losses because they understand that the other participants in the game will not impose such a cost on them such that playing the game is outweighed by their defeats. One of the reasons why what we see in contemporary American politics, this idea of effective polarization or viewing the other side as so existentially threatening that if they win, they would be threatening to yourself, your person, your family, your loved ones, whoever it might be. Within this context, there's no real reason to accept limited gains in exchange for those limited losses. You don't believe the other side is going to limit your losses, and therefore you push for 100% that you can get all of the time. Moreover, winning the quote-unquote final iteration of this game, or otherwise ending democracy, may actually become desirable in order to finally achieve that victory. And thus, democratic norms, beliefs in elections, belief in democracy as a legitimate institution and means of politics is necessarily subordinated here. So keeping this conceptualization of politics, right? Gains and losses here. We need to consider why someone might participate unconventionally in politics here. And in order to do that, we need to break this into a couple different categories here. Your textbook talks about strikes. These can be a form of unconventional political participation, but doesn't necessarily have to be. If individuals in a factory strike for better wages, there's certainly a political implication within there, but that's not quite the same thing as demanding legislation through a protest or demanding greater work safety requirements or the creation of an entity like OSHA through protest. Those are a little bit separate. Also, we need to consider here what are the goals of the individuals who are actually participating in this manner. If they want to bring about change in some way, shape, or form, that is within this bounds of unconventional political participation. But if they seek to otherwise flip the risk board or bring about an alternative form of government other than democracy, that's not really the same type of motivation here. So, when we're thinking about engaging in unconventional political participation, the normal answer for this is that the political mechanisms are not delivering the gains to a group of people or a group of society in the same way. It's this perception that an issue is perhaps deep emphasized or underemphasized, or perhaps that some section of society is permanently removed from achieving the gains that politics is intended to deliver here. We discussed last week about the idea of political socialization, this idea that people are raised, are trained into certain modes of political behavior as normal, particularly in marginalized communities that both historically and now are marginalized from accessing the benefits of politics. It may be the case that certain sections of society are more normalized into unconventional political participation because they need to take those steps to access the gains that other aspects of society are more readily able to access here. Now, there's a bunch of factors that might contribute to someone participating in politics in this way, but the biggest two here are likely accessibility and social incentives. Accessibility is relatively straightforward. If you live in a highly urban area or in an area proximate to where something like a protest is going to occur, the costs of actually participating in that way are much less, rather than if you lived 2 hours away, for example. The idea of accessibility here increases the likelihood of someone participating because they basically have to take less of a cost or incur less of a cost in order to participate here. The other one here are social incentives, and social incentives require a discussion of group identity. We will talk about group identity both in terms of social groups as well as partisan social identity a little bit later on in the course. But fundamentally here, we each have individual identities that we care about. The textbook does a pretty good job discussing the various forms of social identity and group identity and why these might be important. They use the example of a Minnesota Vikings fan or a New England Patriots fan as an example of a sports team identity. Now, identities are many, many layered, multifaceted, we might call them. Some are more and less important to individuals. But fundamentally, a sense of belonging in a group that you value is very, very powerful. Not just in the positive sense that you see some benefit from being a part of that group, be it material or be it psychological, but also fear of being pushed outside of that group, of being ostracized, is incredibly powerful. And thus, threats to the group are seen in an outsized fashion. It's not just you under threat, it's your group that you give value to as being under threat. And therefore, you might be incentivized in a greater fashion to respond in an unconventional manner, to participate politically, if you perceive a threat to your group's well-being. And returning to this idea of ostracization, threats to be pushed out of the group are very powerful, and particularly threats to be pushed outside of the group if you fail to behave in such a manner that the social norms of that group requires can be a powerful motivator here. Now, I will disagree slightly with the textbook. There's a quote within here. When it comes to unconventional participation, though, there is an even higher cost than extensive time and effort. Both social disapproval and risks are likely to be higher for unconventional than for conventional participation. Risks, potentially, but what about the risk of failing to act? If you belong to a social group, a political group, whatever your group is, that sees participating in this way as the socially acceptable thing to do, you might actually incur a social demerit or a social penalty from failing to cohere to that group's norms. If Put it another way, if protest is seen as a positive thing, as a desirable thing, as a required thing, failure to adhere to that social norm can actually carry a large amount of social penalties here. This is further compounded with the rise of social media and what we might call symbolic politics. Rewinding just a couple decades here, going back to 19th century Paris. This was the rise of the opera house and the rise of what we might call high society now. It was the case that wealthy socialites would go out and they would go to the opera house and they would, mingle with their compatriots and have a grand old time. But it was noted during this time period that it was insufficient to simply go to the opera house and to watch the opera or whatever it might be, have a good time and go home. Instead, there was an importance both on seeing and being seen. You want, within this context, to be seen as part of this group. And in order to do that, you need to take visible actions in order to signal that you are a part of this group. It may be the case that unconventional political participation are one of these signals here. And social media allows for the easy dissemination of information about these type of events, increasing the likelihood of someone participating by decreasing the costs of participation in that way. Moreover, with social media, you may have heard the term slacktivism before. This is the idea of someone taking an online action absent real-world action. Really came into the public consciousness around the Occupy Wall Street movement in the early 2010s. But the idea here that simply taking a symbolic action online is replacing real-world actions, real-world participation in a protest, for example. We can kind of see an artifact with this when we look at the World Values Survey and ANES results within the textbook here. It appears to be the case that in the contemporary day, people are much less likely to participate in a protest. Now, this may be the result, as your textbook discusses, that 1971-74 was an unconventional time. It was immediately in the aftermath of the 1960s. Certainly a tumultuous time, a time where protests including and particularly in line with the civil rights movement, were much more popular than they were today, and indeed much more effective in accomplishing political aims than they were today. But don't get too caught up on the term slacktivism here. If we conceptualize the protest and the efficacy of a protest as fundamentally being an attempt to change opinions, to change hearts and minds, a motivated and coordinated social media campaign very well may change people's hearts and minds. And because if we view society, if we view the news through this internet-oriented social media landscape, our perception of what is reality is somewhat warped. And as a result, our perception of what public opinion might be is actually therefore much more warped as well. So despite the kind of catchy name here, it is perhaps a bit overstated in terms of a lack of impact. Finally here, I want to discuss political violence a little bit. Your next response paper prompt asks you to explain or posit why support for political violence might be increasing. Textbook says moralization of partisan differences and the widespread use of social media feeding people's politically homogenous social networks raise the possibility that there will be more political violence in the future. They also discuss how increased support for political violence is correlated where that violence is seen as reciprocal, where the other side is initiating that violence. Many people see that the correct recourse in this context is to respond with political violence. I want you to consider factors beyond the growth of social media and beyond this type of effective polarization. What other factors, what failures of the government or of society may be contributing to the rise in support, albeit small, that we are seeing in recent years? So that's all that I have for you today. Appearing on screen now are a list of due dates for this week. There's only one reading coinciding with the response paper here, so be sure to give that your utmost attention. As always, feel free to contact me via email or set up a Zoom meeting if you wish to discuss anything any further. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you next Monday.